Well, thank you, Dr. Gleave, for the introduction. It's a pleasure this morning to talk about this important topic, the environmental impacts within urology. But I'd like to take a more general approach to this up front as well, looking at the environmental impacts with the healthcare system in general, as well as surgery in the operating room. Now, I don't have any financial or disclosures or conflicts of interest to note. My objectives for the talk this morning will be to review the impact of healthcare and more specifically surgery on the environment, and then look at a couple of cases to evaluate the carbon footprint of them, including reusable versus single-use urologic endoscopes, and attempting to compare renal transplant with dialysis. And throughout my talk, I hope to be suggesting measures both everyday and larger scale, which we can all use to improve the impact that our everyday work has on the environment. So the World Health Organization states that climate change is the #1 public health challenge of the 21st century. It's ironic that despite climate change being a public health problem, we typically think of other sectors as the key contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, such as energy or fossil fuel use, air or vehicle travel, and agriculture. And healthcare is often overlooked for its environmental impacts compared to other sectors. However, in reality, Canada's healthcare system produces over 33 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents each year, representing 4.6% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And while this is similar to other countries, and it certainly does appear better than the United States healthcare system being the greatest contributor worldwide from a healthcare standpoint, at nearly 9 to 10% of their overall greenhouse gas emissions. This is still a significant contribution. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that based on climate models, we must limit the rise in global temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In other words, compared to the 18th century, before temperature rise started. This threshold is suggested as even small rises above this temperature, even to 2 degrees Celsius, for example, are estimated to result in greater intensity and frequency of extreme temperatures and extreme weather events, such as heat waves, floods, droughts, and adverse air pollution, which all have human health impacts. In order to limit this rise in temperature, drastic changes in the global greenhouse gas emissions are required in order to move towards net zero emissions by the end of the century, as depicted by this infographic, where even current policies will certainly be much higher than this threshold, but that we really have to have quite aggressive measures taken in order to ultimately result in net zero emissions. It's in fact that these climate models, which all this data is based on, which resulted in the Nobel Prize recently being awarded in physics to these three scientists for their groundbreaking contributions to the formation of climate models and the understanding of the physical systems on Earth, and have ultimately shown that increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels result in global temperature rise. So now we understand that the healthcare system is a significant contributor to climate change, and that climate change itself has direct health impacts on humans. The problem is that the healthcare system will continue to be stressed as a result of increasing health impacts due to climate change, which continues the cycle of further healthcare utilization. Now, from a more renal-centric point of view, Baraka and other authors in a recent Nature Reviews Nephrology article propose mechanisms by which climate change results in increasing diseases of the kidney, such as rising temperatures, altered rainfall patterns, and increased extreme weather events, which ultimately result in more acute and chronic kidney diseases, which at one point the urologists may become involved in, as well as increasing kidney stone disease as well. Now, looking at the healthcare sector specifically, the greatest contributors overall are hospital services and pharmaceuticals. Within the hospital, the largest producer of waste, of hospital waste, is the operating room, in some studies accounting for up to 70% of the total hospital waste. And we know that the operating room is a very resource-intensive environment. Interestingly, our colleagues in nephrology here also play a significant role due to the high energy and water use required for dialysis in renal replacement therapy. But I'll speak more on this later as well. But ultimately, this makes the operating room a great opportunity for environmental stewardship to have potentially large impact. Within urology, which is a field, well known for its leadership in technological advancements, many individuals are now advocating for the rational use of technology and for consideration towards the carbon footprint that these new technologies may ultimately increase. The trouble is, first of all, we don't fully understand the environmental impacts of most of the current or new technologies that are coming out. Now, Dr. Bodo Knudsen, in the Journal of Endourology back in 2018, I think he eloquently stated that we as surgeons are ultimately the end users of medical devices, and we therefore play a critical role in waste prevention. And it's our role to challenge the manufacturers of these devices, as well as hospital purchasing and other administrative personnel, to develop medical devices in environmentally conscious ways and to assist with the recycling of these instruments. Now, we are very fortunate to have individuals like Dr. McNeil, who's joining us today, who are leading the road in terms of, from a research perspective, on how to guide these environmental choices within the operating room. In a recent study that she published just last year, she discusses the idea of a circular healthcare economy, which moves away from a traditional linear model, where products are produced by manufacturers from resources that are extracted from the earth in an emissions-intense method, which are then packaged and sterilized and transported to the operating room for their use by us, and oftentimes for a single use before their disposal. In an ideal circular economy where items are first of all, reduced in that we think rationally about which items we're using, but also when we do use items, they're reused, repaired, or recycled in ways that will ultimately minimize overall emissions while still keeping the goal of maintaining high quality of care. The standard approach to evaluating a product's carbon emissions is to consider its entire product life cycle. And this starts all the way at the extraction of the raw materials from the earth, and results in the, as a part of the manufacturing of the product, the packaging of these products and sterilization before they're being distributed and transported to the location of its intended use, and ultimately resulting in its disposal. And it's often these more upstream factors, including the raw materials and manufacturing processes, which are overlooked when we consider a product's environmental impact. And so by the time it reaches us for use, say, for example, in the operating room, it has often already contributed significantly to the environment. And so this is why strategies which focus only on the downstream disposal of goods will ultimately fail in reducing the emissions, because it's not looking at the entire picture. And as I'll discuss a bit later, life cycle assessments are not the be-all and end-all, because they're quite institution and product specific. And so we need to consider that when we're comparing items using life cycle assessments. Now, Dr. McNeil also had published a leading paper in 2017 where their team evaluated the greenhouse gas emissions from the operating theaters at 3 different academic hospitals, and importantly, in different healthcare systems. And they reported the total the total greenhouse gas emissions over that 1 year. And Vancouver General Hospital was one of these 3 sites. They used a standardized protocol known as the greenhouse gas protocol, which breaks down emissions into their different scopes. Scope 1 emissions are those that are directly involved in greenhouse gas emissions. So in the operating theater, this is almost exclusively the inhaled anesthetic gases which are released, and to a minor role, carbon dioxide. Scope 2 and 3 emissions are indirect, with Scope 2 being related to the energy consumption, primarily HVAC systems in the operating room. And in Scope 3, the supply chain and the disposal of goods, including the full life cycle that we just recently discussed. And so I think while we're not directly responsible for delivering anesthesia, this is, I think, a great example of why it's important to do studies like this. Anesthetic gases, as we know, are inhaled and then exhaled, and they're actually removed through the OR ventilation system, but are released directly into the atmosphere. Each of these anesthetic agents have their own global warming potential, which is a measure of their environmental impact. And desflurane, while it is desirable in some ways for its use in terms of onset of action and recovery from anesthesia, has the greatest global warming potential of all 3, which is 5 times more than isoflurane, or nearly 20 times more than sevoflurane. And so it's very interesting here to see that at John Radcliffe Hospital, which is in the UK, where desflurane was not used at all, primarily, I think, related to its cost, the Scope 1 emissions from this hospital were 10 times less than the other 2 hospitals individually, including Vancouver General Hospital. And so it's my understanding that since this study has been published, our colleagues in anesthesia have significantly cut back on their use of desflurane. Now, looking at the other scopes of emissions in this study, it becomes clear that Vancouver General Hospital here has a significantly less Scope 2 emissions compared to the other hospitals. And there's a couple factors in play with regards to this. One of this is the ability for the ORs at VGH to control ventilation during periods when they're not in use, i.e. overnight. They can direct it just to the operating rooms that are required. Another factor, though, is that we're very fortunate here in British Columbia to have much cleaner energy supply as a result of more renewable sources that compared to the UK or even the United States. Now, the Scope 3 emissions, which are a result of the supply chain between all 3 hospitals, were relatively similar, although VGH certainly had the highest. And overall, these numbers in the millions of CO2 equivalents each year are quite significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the selection of our waste in the OR does matter. Dr. McNeil's study shows here as an example the trajectory of surgical waste at VGH, which is helpful for us to use as a comparison. The biomedical and cytotoxic waste has a much greater carbon footprint when we compare it to general medical waste in the hospital. And this is a result of it being incinerated in a process that releases more emissions, as well as the fact that biomedical and cytotoxic waste travel often much further to the place of processing, and then before they are finally disposed of, further increasing its environmental footprint. It's also important to note that biomedical waste costs significantly more. I believe it's in the order of 10 times as much to process as compared to general medical waste in the hospital. And so we should be aware of where we dispose of items in the operating room. One study from 2011 suggested that up to 90% of waste that was disposed of in these red biohazard bins was actually misallocated and could have been disposed of into the general medical waste bin. And they've proposed a number of items which we use every day in the operating room: Foley catheters, IV bags, suction tube and drapes, which could be disposed of in the general waste and do not have to fill up the biohazard waste. Now, what about the impact of minimally invasive surgery? Nicholas Power and their colleagues there published their work in the Journal of Endourology back in 2012, where they calculated carbon emissions from minimally invasive surgery, that is laparoscopic and robotic surgery, during the year of 2009 in the United States. And this amounted to 2.5 million procedures being performed in that year. And surely this number has only risen since then, over a decade ago. So they calculated using a similar life cycle assessment, comparing the carbon emissions from the additional resources that are required for laparoscopic or robotic surgery above and beyond open surgery. So they did not consider all emissions, such as the operating room energy use, because they assumed that this was similar for open surgery. However, what they did focus on was direct and indirect emissions related to the use of carbon dioxide in these cases, as well as additional instruments and disposable items, which are required for these cases above and beyond open surgery. And so we see on the left here that urology is a significant user of MIS, with over 124,000 cases during 2009. And ultimately, the bottom line for their scope 1 emissions that they found was that direct emissions, i.e. the release of CO2 from the canisters in the operating room, resulted in 303 tons of CO2 equivalents. Now, to put this in perspective, 1 ton of CO2 equivalents is probably equivalent to a return trip air travel between, I believe it's New York and Paris. So this number, however, is not that drastic when we compare it to the emissions of CO2 related to the manufacturing of carbon dioxide for its use in the OR. And we see this when they've broken down the emissions for each component. As you see here, the emissions related to just the manufacturing and energy required to manufacture carbon dioxide for its use in the OR is significant at over 350,000 tons, meaning that for every liter of CO2 that we use in the operating room, it's already released 1,000 times that much before we even use it. And they go on further to show that the disposable items used during these cases contribute even further to a point where the total carbon emissions just related to MIS surgery in 1 year are over 355,000 tons of CO2. And now this is not to say that we should not be using laparoscopic or robotic surgery because they have obvious benefits when used rationally. But it does illustrate that these technologies continue to increase carbon emissions instead of moving towards decreasing them. And we need to understand this in order to move towards an ideal net zero healthcare environment. And just as a further example, this study in 2015 by a group of gynecologists compared robotic versus laparoscopic versus laparotomy or open surgery. And they calculated the estimated carbon emissions from each of these. And they found that robotic surgery, not surprisingly, had over 75% greater use than open surgery, for example, for similar cases. And primarily, most of this driver is in the difference of waste, particularly single-use instruments. And again, this is not to say that we should be now switching back to open surgery because of the environmental benefit, but we do need to understand these impacts, including the upstream and downstream effects, in order to identify ways that these technologies can become less impactful. Now, finally, before I move on to some specific urology cases, this systematic review focused on comparing reusable and disposable laparoscopic instruments. And the primary theoretical, I must highlight, theoretical advantages of disposable instruments are of improved quality, ease of use, as well as concerns related to infection or sterility with reuse of these instruments. But it's important to note that there's actually been no studies to suggest there's any increased rate of infections. And even if a study was to be performed, it would be quite difficult because the rate of infections would be so low. One other interesting thing they noted was that more experienced surgeons tended to have lower associated costs in the comparison. And this may be as a result of more experienced surgeons understanding or selecting more efficiently their case carts, or moving towards not using or opening instruments that are not necessary upfront. And so ultimately they highlighted that overall, when they compared this, there's a significant deficiency in the evidence that surrounds the cost and environmental impacts related to reusable instruments. Now, moving on, I would like to discuss a few urology-specific cases, starting with the comparison of reusable and single-use urologic endoscopes. These single-use flexible endoscopes are gaining quite a bit of interest in our field as the technology really has caught up, allowing for quite impressive visualization, as you can see here in one of Dr. Chu's videos of the Boston Scientific LithoView being utilized in a percutaneous nephrolithotomy, that it's quite comparable. They also have other similar features to reusable scopes. And so it appears that the technology really has caught up with the reusable scopes. And there are a number of other single-use scopes which have now begun to enter the market. And with regards to flexible ureteroscopy, one of the particular concerns is the high cost of repairs, as well as the often frequent nature of damage to these scopes. Focusing on single-use flexible cystoscopes, which have also started to enter the market. These scopes have features which make it appealing in some ways in terms of portability. They're often marketed with a small handheld screen, which may make it more appealing for use in the emergency department or certain ambulatory setups. Or, I could foresee this being useful in certain maybe third world areas where they have limited access to infrastructure. This was a recent abstract, though, just published last month by Kevin Koo and colleagues, which compared the environmental impact of these single-use flexible cystoscopes with the reusable flexible cystoscopes. In their model, at their service, they have 16 reusable scopes in use, and the average lifespan for these reusable cystoscopes is quite impressive at just over 11 years. And their reusable scopes show a high case volume of more than 200 cases before they require repair, and nearly 4,000 cases before a scope is disposed of. They utilize the manufacturing carbon footprint for the individual components of the cystoscopes in order to calculate the expected carbon footprint during the manufacturing process. But this is an estimate and is about 11.5 kilograms of CO2 emissions per kilogram of the endoscope. And we'll see a similar number being used for the production of flexible ureteroscopes. The results from this study show that the manufacturing footprint of single-use cystoscopes contributes to the majority of the carbon footprint related to these single-use scopes emissions at 2.3 kilograms of CO2 per use. The footprint is therefore much higher with these single-use scopes compared to the reusable scopes, where the high case volume allows the manufacturing component to be distributed over a significant number of cases. And so this high number of cases really drives the lower carbon footprint we see with the reusable scopes. And now they even found that if they were to adjust their case volume in half or by twice as much, that the carbon footprint would remain similar with regards to reusable flexible cystoscopes. And it's likely that, although I didn't see a cost-effectiveness evaluation probably would show similar results that would favor reusable cystoscopes. Now, changing gears to focus on the flexible ureteroscopes, the picture is different. The cost effectiveness for single-use ureteroscopes has been brought into question to rationalize its best use scenario. The reusable scopes gain their cost effectiveness, as we know from the flexible cystoscope model, over the dispersion of these upfront costs, as well as repair costs over multiple cases. And therefore, the frequency of these repairs and the associated costs will dictate the best economic use case. So one study that was published in 2017 by Dr. Martin and others in the Journal of Urology suggested that they looked at the economic comparison, suggesting that single-use flexible ureteroscopes would be cost beneficial only in low volume centers. So those are centers performing less than 100 cases per year due to the upfront costs with reusable scopes. And in another study by Ozimek and others in 2017, it suggested that single-use scopes may ideally be used in cases where there's a higher risk for scope damage. The two main factors that they found associated within their population were the steep infundibulopelvic angle, or a larger multiple lower pole stones. And these are scenarios which may be able to be predicted based on preoperative imaging to highlight the cost effectiveness use for single-use ureteroscopes in this setting. Now, there's only been one available study that I found published on the environmental impacts comparing reusable and single-use ureteroscopes, which was published by Neal Davis and colleagues in the Journal of Endourology from 2018, where they compared the Boston Scientific LithoVue single-use ureteroscope with an Olympus flexible video ureteroscope. They estimated carbon emissions based on, again, the per weight material components. And the LithoView, interestingly, weighs about 1/3 of the weight of a reusable scope. And so it would suggest that there's lower manufacturing emissions. But this is based on an estimate. And so I wonder if, because of all the resources that go into manufacturing, whether this is truly a similar comparison. But importantly, at the center where this study was published, which was out of Melbourne, they report on their uses, number of uses before their ureteroscopes are repaired, on the order of 16 uses before repair and 180 uses before decommissioning. Their results were in some ways surprising to me, in that the total carbon footprint on a per case basis was essentially the same, around 4.4 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per case. And the main contributor for the single-use ureteroscopes, as we know, is the result of the manufacturing process, which is high. However, with regard to the reusable scopes, the major carbon footprint was actually related to the washing and sterilization of these scopes, which require 165 liters per wash. And each wash cycle can only handle two, at least in their study, two flexible ureteroscopes. So the other consideration here is the frequency of repairs. And we need to consider that, and I'll show shortly here some local data from VGH, but we also need to critically evaluate this life cycle assessment, as I mentioned before, as a use to be able to compare these two items. One thing that comes to mind is that the source of energy between Australia and British Columbia is likely to be quite different, where in BC we have focused on cleaner energy. And so, we have to think about how we can, apply these results to practice here, much in the same way that we think about critically appraising other scientific papers. So I was interested in determining the frequency of repairs at our own center here at VGH. And I reached out to our biomedical engineering department and our scope provider, who were kind enough to share some of this data for presentation. We had a total of 42 flexible endoscope repairs performed between January 2019 and just recently end of August 2021 at VGH alone. In 2019, the mean time before failure was at 102 days, and we were getting about 17 uses before repair. Unfortunately, this has been decreasing significantly to the point where in 2021, we've essentially doubled this repair frequency and associated costs, where we've had 22 repairs in the first 8 months of 2021, accounting for only 8 uses before repair. And the average repair cost for a flexible ureteroscope is on the order of $10,000, or a flexible cystoscope on the order of $5,000. And so in 2020, our repair costs were in the realm of $600,000 for VGH and UBC. And this is up from $250,000 only 5 years ago. So there's a significant rise within the past year. And this is something that our department's been looking into. For example, whether there's any impact within the rollout of the new thulium laser fiber in terms of optimizing its energy settings. But when I looked at the data comparing the type of damage, the damage seemed to be comparable between the working channel and the external sheath on these scopes, suggesting that it wouldn't entirely be related to this, at least not on its own. And so this is just a slide to show that in the literature, other centers have found that flexible ureteroscopes are typically about 17 or 18 uses before repair. And these are a few of the pictures from our site specifically depicting the type of damage that we may see. at the working channel as well as the external shaft. Now, I'll move on here to discuss try and attempt to discuss the carbon footprint of renal transplant in comparison with forms of dialysis. As we are well aware, renal transplant has been shown to have significant improvements in terms of survival, quality of life, and reduced costs to the healthcare system as a result of taking patients off of dialysis, which is a resource-intensive endeavor. It would therefore make sense, at least to me, that renal transplant would also improve environmental impacts associated with dialysis. We know that hemodialysis requires a large amount of energy, water, and produces a significant amount of medical waste on a frequent basis. And peritoneal dialysis, while requiring less energy, still uses a large volume of dialysate, which is manufactured and has to be transported to patients. And previous studies have shown that renal transplant is cost-effective for both living and deceased donors. And previous studies have shown that the cost-effectiveness break-even point for transplant ends up being about 3 years afterwards, where we start to see the cost benefit. This cost-effectiveness evaluation does, however, depend on the quality of the donated organ. And for example, living donors are the most economically beneficial because they provide the longest survival of the allograft, and therefore time off of dialysis, which is the costly component. And higher risk organs have, this article here just more recently suggests that even higher risk organs, while they may be associated with, in some cases, higher costs of transplant due to increasing rejection and other complications or sooner time to being placed back onto dialysis, that over the period of time, renal transplant still improves the quality adjusted life years. And so it's still, depending on even higher risk organs, are shown to be cost effective over longer periods of time. Now, hemodialysis, as I mentioned, is obviously resource intensive. It uses anywhere from 120 to sometimes 800 liters of water per session, which of course is run 3 times per week on average. And this results in over 18,000 liters of water per year per patient on hemodialysis. And this doesn't account for the additional hazardous waste which is produced during dialysis treatment sessions, or the use of electricity, which is significant on a per treatment basis. And estimates out of the UK and Australia suggest that that hemodialysis results in 3.8 to 10.2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year per patient. And peritoneal dialysis is not great either. It utilizes 6 to 12 liters of dialysate per day, which is a manufactured product. The daily waste per patient results in over 600 kilograms of waste per year. And there's the upstream supply chain considerations with regard to the transportation of PD fluid from the site of manufacturing to patients, often on a weekly basis. Now, I was only able to find one study, which is out of China, which evaluated the environmental impact of peritoneal dialysis. And this study didn't seem to take into consideration the emissions related to the transportation on a weekly basis of the dialysate fluid. Nonetheless, they suggest that PD results in a carbon impact of 1.4 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents each year for a patient on peritoneal dialysis. So putting all this together, we see that estimates for the carbon emissions are significant for dialysis. And to put this into further perspective, the World Bank of carbon dioxide emissions provides a metric for average yearly total emissions per Canadian. So that's the number of emissions for a Canadian across the entire year, to be around just over 15 tons of CO2 per year. And so dialysis representing a significant proportion of this would suggest that it's highly impactful on the environment. And so what about renal transplant then? Unfortunately, there really have not been many studies to quantify this. There was one abstract that I could find from 2016 at the American Transplant Congress, which addressed the question of the environmental impact. And due to the fact that it's an abstract, the methodology and data is limited. So they considered a 15-year period for renal replacement therapy. And they considered, with regard to dialysis, the previous energy use, water supplies, and waste that I previously mentioned. For renal transplant, they documented that they considered the OR equipment and OR energy use for the surgery, as well as the processing of all the instruments for the case. Now, they didn't provide overall admissions in the abstract, but they did report the percent reduction seen by a transplant in comparison to hemodialysis, where they found that renal transplant reduced carbon emissions by 95% in comparison to hemodialysis, and just over 90% when compared with peritoneal dialysis. And so I calculated, based on these percentages, a rough estimate based on the previous numbers that I'd shown, suggesting that renal transplant may be as low as on the order of 0.15 tons of CO2 equivalents per year on average. But this is, it's unclear whether the study had considered the additional potential environmental impacts related to transplant, including whether patients had required readmission, had complications, or the immunosuppressive medications, which can also have a significant impact. And so, based on this very preliminary study, it does appear that renal transplant improves environmental outcomes, but we do need further data on this. And so just to wrap everything up, I would like to discuss a couple of everyday uses in which we could consider improving the impact of our operations on the environment. This is a study that Wormer and their colleagues in 2013 presented, which was of a single center green OR initiative led by a surgeon and a nurse, which was centered around education of operating room staff and simple solutions to this problem. For example, we may notice that one of Dr. Black's pet peeves, the use of foam waste, was focused on. They completely removed foam waste and replaced it with reusable gel padding. And not only did they reduce that waste, but they showed that there is an approximate cost savings each year in the order of $50,000 to make this change. They also employed teaching around the appropriate disposal of biohazard waste. And they switched from large red bins to small red kick buckets to reinforce this. And they found that they reduced their biohazardous waste by 75%. And this was also associated with a significant cost savings. So there are everyday decisions that we can make to start working towards this improvement in our environmental impact. And another activity that many of our, I believe all of our staff are already doing, is being involved in telehealth. Virtual clinics have obviously increased as a result of the COVID pandemic, but hopefully they'll be here to stay in the appropriate use case, as they do have other benefits as well. This was a systematic review published just last year in light of COVID in the British Journal of Urology. And they evaluated articles which published on virtual urology clinics. And these were, many of them were small scale studies at single centers. But the take home points were that telehealth, when used in the appropriate patient context, was safe, was well received by providers and the patients, resulted in shorter times to being seen which in our current age of increasing wait times is an important metric. And it resulted in reduction in carbon emissions, primarily related to travel. And it even has a decreased cost associated with it, both for patients and clinics. So where do we go from here? In order to prevent the environmental and subsequent public health effects of a rise in global temperature above 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels, we need to limit emissions to 50%. This is overall within all sectors, to 50% of the levels in 2010. And we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So we're fortunate, though, to have leaders, including at UBC in this field, who will help us achieve these goals, led by Dr. Andrea McNeil and her group, who've recently launched the UBC Planetary Healthcare Lab just recently this spring. This is an initiative collaborating between numerous fields, including healthcare economics, engineering, and it's the Vancouver Coastal Health also published their commitment towards this important goal. So I would like to thank Dr. McNeil and Dr. Chu, as well as Nicole Nee from Biomed for their assistance in providing data and the discussion around this topic today. I'd open the floor up to any discussion or questions that people have.